Good morning, class. Today our objective is to understand the evolution and the elements of the communication model. So we're going to start back in the beginning at the first communication model. And the first communication model, which was developed in the late 40s, early 50s, is the linear model of communication. And I say linear because you have a sender in that model, and then you have the person receiving. And originally that's how communication was depicted. Now that sender is going to actually encode a message. Encoding simply means that I am taking these thoughts and ideas that I have in my head, and I'm attaching symbols to them. And symbols would be the words and gestures that I'm using to send that message. So I'm going to encode a message to the receiver. The receiver is then going to decode my message, which simply means they're going to take the symbols, the words and gestures that I've sent, and they're going to turn it back into meaning for them. These messages travel through channels. Channels are verbal and nonverbal. For instance, as I'm speaking with you today, my words are traveling through the verbal channel, but my gestures and facial expressions and body movement all are traveling through the nonverbal channel. Now clearly, the more we can utilize, the more channels we can utilize in communication, the more effective our communication will be. And a good example of that is with technology today. How many times have you received a text and you misinterpreted that text? And maybe you took it the wrong way and it created a little conflict in that relationship. Well, that may be because you weren't utilizing all the channels, because when we communicate through technology, we lose that nonverbal channel. That's why emoticons and those types of things are so important in technology messages, so that we can make sure that our meaning is understood correctly. So that was the original model, the linear model. And then the model evolved in the 1960s, and they said, you know what? There's more to this process than this linear model. It doesn't end with the receiver. So they added two elements. One was feedback. Now feedback is simply a response. If you ask me a question and I say yes, that is a verbal feedback for you. An example of nonverbal feedback would be nodding my head, shaking my head this way, that sort of thing. You know, waving at somebody will be an example of a response. Asking questions is a response, is feedback. And then the second element they added was context. Now context can be one of three different types of, context is just simply the situation that the communication is occurring. So the first one would be the physical context. For instance, the room that you're in. If you are sitting in the room with someone, it is more likely that your communication is going to be more easily understood than, say, for instance, if you're yelling at someone who's in another room. You've got more opportunities for interference and misunderstandings to take place because you have some physical barriers that are preventing you from being able to understand each other. The second is the psychological context. When we're having a stressful day, we don't communicate very clearly. Sometimes we have trouble encoding, we have trouble decoding. I might be a little short with people. When I'm encoding, I might not use the best word to send my message. Decoding, maybe I'm distracted if I'm stressed or worried about something, so I don't decode the message in an appropriate way. And then, of course, it affects the feedback and the whole communication situation. And I'm sure you've all experienced situations in your life like that where it's created some difficulty because of the psychological context. The last context is the historical context. And this is simply a situation where perhaps, let's say I'm in a group of people and my friend walks up and says, "Hey, did you watch that last night?" And then we begin talking about that. Well, the other people in the group weren't privy to, obviously, what we had been talking about watching last night. So it's going to affect their understanding of that communication situation, where my friend and I understand what we're talking about, but the others in the group do not. So that's another example of how the context can lead to communication issues. All right, so that is the exchange model. That's the second model of communication. The more recently adopted model from communication scholars is the transactional model. Now, if you notice, the transactional model has the sender and the receiver and all the same elements that we've talked about here. However, the arrows go in both directions. And that simply means that both people are equally responsible for making sure that communication takes place. We both have to be actively engaged participants in that communication process, and we have to both have to give and receive. Another element that I didn't mention here that we might down in this model that often affects communication is noise. Noise can be internal noise. Noise can be, I'm hungry and I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch. I am thinking about my Walmart list and that's distracting me. I'm worried about my sick child who's at school. It can be anything that's going on internally. And I'll give you some information here that the average speaker can speak at 125 words per minute. The average listener can comprehend from 600 to 800 words per minute. So you see the problem there is we have a huge gap. And that's where that breakdown occurs, because we let our noise and we get the context, everything can get in there and get in the way of our really staying focused and engaged in that communication situation and creating conflict and misunderstandings to occur. External noise can be anything. A siren outside, the motorcycle on the road, the air conditioner kicking on, the clock ticking in the room. It can be anything that you actually can hear. Airplanes flying overhead. Maybe you have people that like to click pins around you and that's a real distraction for you. Those would all be examples of external noise. So they certainly are barriers to being able to share communication meaningfully in the same way. So today, class, our objective was to understand the evolution and the elements of the communication model. So we began by looking at the linear model, which was sender to receiver. And the sender encodes messages, the receiver decodes messages, and sends feedback. We added that to the exchange model, which was the second model. We added feedback and context. Context is the physical, psychological, and historical. And then we said more reflective of what communication is occurring today would be the transactional model. And that's the final model that theorists have identified. And that says that both people are equally responsible for communication occurring. Now, if you have questions about this or you need further elaboration on what's been discussed today, I encourage you to send me an email or give me a call, and we'll be happy to clarify any questions that you have.